Well, officially, good morning. My name is John. Many of you know me, and I know many of you, but welcome. This is a place where we can believe what we believe and struggle with what we struggle with. Today, we're going to talk about hope, and you might be in good supply or you might be in scarcity. We'll see what we can do about both of those. So, sometimes hope surprises us. And for me, music in particular has been a source of emotional and spiritual lift when I have felt that inner sinking. A few years ago, I was lying in bed, phone in hand, doing what I'd grown used to doing each morning. I was doom scrolling on social media and finding more than enough to derail my spirits before I'd even set foot on the ground. I don't know if you understand what that feeling is like. As if on cue, my blood pressure started to rise and my hope began to evaporate. It was going to be another miserable day in Magaville until I noticed that my favorite band, U2, was playing a show that night in DC. Now, that's a good 4-hour drive if traffic on 95 isn't horrible, and traffic on 95 is never not horrible, right? But something inside me said, you need to go. And I didn't have a ticket for the concert. That was one barrier. I'd have to leave the house in a matter of minutes to even hope to make it, and I had tons of important work to do, or at least what seemed important a few moments later. But suddenly I needed to do something more important. I needed to stand in the middle of a stadium with 50,000 strangers and sing, "It's a Beautiful Day." I needed to get out of my dry and brittle rut and to cultivate some fresh hope. I could feel my adrenaline surging at the idea. My spirit quickened as if sensing a glorious disruption was about to take place. And I went into our home office and I mentioned it to my wife, who, having lived with me for 28 years, found such wild impulsiveness perfectly normal. And she said, "Sure, go." I scored a ticket online, and I was in the car within a few minutes. And the traffic on 95 was terrible. But instead of complaining, this was now an acceptable burden. I cranked up the music and I enjoyed the rush of wind through the open windows. And it's funny, when you're invested in something, the challenges and obstacles don't appear the same. I reached the venue with just a few moments to spare, and by the time the sun set on a day that began quite ordinarily, I was standing in a pulsating sea of humanity as the Edge's shimmering guitar chords washed over us, and Bono led a group of strangers to church with the opening call to prayer. The heart is a bloom. It shoots up through the stony ground. My endlessly racing heart finally slowed. The ever-clenched muscles in my jaw released. My labored breathing stretched from short, shallow sips into slow, savoring swells. My chest expanded and contracted fully without interruption, and my mind no longer chased what had been or might be or should be, and I paused to quietly rest in what was. I drove home at 1 a.m., exhausted but filled, because I had had my sense of optimism recalibrated. And it wasn't about the band or the music, because I could have experienced those things without the slightest inconvenience or expense. What I craved was community. I craved the collective gathering of like-hearted people so that I could be reminded that I was not alone. I needed the soul medicine that only a community of hope can bring. And hope, like fear, is easily spread to other people. And that's why human beings, that's why we love story so much, because we are a people of story. We're moved by it. We're propelled by story. We have our imaginations awakened by a good story. Our social media profiles are essentially collections of stories, ours and other people's. And when we meet someone for the first time, one of the most exciting and difficult tasks is catching them up on our story to this point. You remember when you met someone and you were 14 and oh my gosh, I got to learn about you. I got to find out about you. And now when you get older, that backstory is longer. It takes a while to catch people up on who we are. But what story does, though, is it binds us together. It reminds us of our commonalities. And it allows us to participate in events that we were not present for. Now, you all weren't there at the concert with me, but I wanted to try and take you as close as I could. And imagination and empathy allowed that to happen because you began to hear my description and you painted a picture in your head, and your sense of empathy knows what it's like to be excited and to be thrilled and to be optimistic. And so in a way, we were there together. We always have that. Oh, let me tell you about a time and then we get to be in a place we had never been before. Or when you're with someone who you have experienced life with, you get to remember, you get to recreate it. Remember that time we did this, right? And our nations have a connected story that we are a part of. Our faith traditions are built on a shared story. Our families are a legacy of a single story that we have participated in. And this community has a shared story. We're moved by narratives because they tap into our own stories, because we feel affinity in other people's experience of being human. One of the gifts we have as humans is that empathy that allows us to step into the shoes of another, to imagine what it feels like to walk a road that we may have never walked, but because we know the emotions that accompany our journeys, we're able to somehow connect there. See, we know what it is to be terrified. And so we find commonality in another person's fear. We understand what it is to love, and when others love, we can connect with that impulse. We understand what it feels like to lose someone, and when someone else grieves, we mourn with them. And these universal emotions of joy and despair and love and grief, they're connective. And they're also contagious. The longer we're surrounded by a certain narrative or a particular emotional condition, it can be easy to be pulled into that mindset. What we often think of today as cults or political tribalism, these are simply emotional affinity communities that have drawn people together with a similar perspective, a certain set of lenses, a shared narrative about the world. We can even believe ourselves to be one kind of community and not realize that we have slowly suffered mission drift, and maybe we aren't. One day about a year ago, I was hosting a Zoom gathering for our Empathetic People Network. Some of you are here, a part of that network. It's a group of people who care deeply about the world, and they simply want to join together every day and share life. And we have video gatherings every couple of weeks, and that's a chance to hear from interesting creators and activists and communicators. And we get updates about one another's lives. We talk about issues, we wrestle with questions, and we share the experience of being human. And one day, as the conversation progressed, I started to notice something. I noticed a pattern in the stories that people were sharing. They were becoming more and more starved of hope. They were invariably describing sadness and worry. And it didn't matter the topic that we started with. Inevitably, things drifted toward the grief and despair of the world and the loss of agency. People began sharing their relational fractures and political news and what felt like the persistent doom hovering over everything. And while I understood it all and I felt it all, what I kept thinking was, hopelessness is seeping in. We might be morphing into a complaining community, one that is only able to react negatively because of how much we have endured. And I didn't want us to be that. I didn't want us to become a fear-centered tribe. I wanted us to be a hope-centered tribe. And so I didn't challenge anyone else, I challenged myself. I tried to find the possibilities as often as I saw the problems. To look at something negative and say, but what can I do? Or how can I see this differently than I would normally see it? Because I realize that the muscle memory of despair is powerful, isn't it? Most of us have a PTSD from 2016 and the insurrection and COVID, and this trauma, it lives in our bodies and our brains, right? It's there, even when we don't acknowledge it. And I think we've all gotten used to being let down or suffering loss or seeing ugliness that seems to be winning. And if you lose enough times after getting back up and fighting, eventually you say to hell with it and you stop fighting. And I think a lot of us have reached that place many times, right? I've shared the quote from Augustine of Hippo. I want to share it again today because it says that hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain as they are. Hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain as they are. Now, we've spent a good deal of time in anger. Anger is often tethered to grief, and both of those find their roots in our capacity for empathy. We're angry because we've seen things that have broken our hearts, and we feel deeply for a world that is suffering. And that empathy has left many of us depleted. Anger and courage, and I know the anger has been easy. And I'm going to take that anger and I'm going to change it to compassion, because remember, it's related to grief and to empathy. So compassion and courage, that's what hope is. And I think we now need to move into the courageous part. And any new pattern begins with a humble decision, a small alteration that in itself seems inconsequential, but one that over time will fundamentally alter our course. Whether it's an exercise program or a work project or a relationship repair, the small shift to do the work of change has to take place, and often we need support or collaborators to help us. That's why people often say, if you want to pursue a goal or chase a dream, share it with someone else, because then it becomes real. And that gives you people to cheer you on or partner with you or make you accountable. And that's what we have in this community. We can give voice to our dreams and have other people come alongside to help make those reality. Now, I was here last about, a month ago, 6 weeks ago. It was just after the first presidential debate. And there was a palpable sense of despair and hopelessness, and there was a preemptive grieving for a situation that had begun to feel like a lost cause, a foregone conclusion. And I noticed an irritability and impatience, a negativity that, while not unfounded, still felt out of character. And this is me I'm talking about. No, but I did feel that in the room that day. And this community has always been about the perseverance of hope, of the leaning into the best of our humanity, of defiant joy despite circumstantial evidence. And I was a bit concerned. But I've been paying attention to the conversations that I've been having here, people have had here over the last couple of weeks online. Talked to some of you today, and things seem a bit different. You look different. The energy feels new. The positivity more tangible. And I came across a quote from Nelson Mandela, and it reminded me of you and me and what we're trying to do here. He said, "I am fundamentally an optimist. Whether that comes from nature or nurture, I cannot say. And part of being optimistic is to keep one's head pointed toward the sun, one's feet moving forward. There were many dark moments when my faith in humanity was sorely tested, and I would not and could not give myself up to despair. That way lays defeat and death." And author Maxine Hong Kingston says, "In a time of destruction, create something." This is the creative moment. See, over the past few weeks, I think we're discovering what happens when hope unexpectedly finds its way into our bloodstream again. The way we suddenly rediscover reservoirs of energy and creativity that we thought were dried up. How much it changes the way we face the day, and the way we encounter barriers, and the way we think about the future. It isn't just hope, but it is the surprise of hope when it seems least likely. Now, please hear me. We are a spiritual community. We are not a political organization. We all believe firmly in the separation of church and state. But we understand that all politics is our collective humanity being expressed and made visible through laws and rules. It's the voice of the people, or at least in a democracy, it should be the voice of a large segment of its people, declaring who we will be and what we will not abide. And right now, the political landscape is showing us what happens when there is an outbreak of hope. How easily transmittable it is. The way it exponentially spreads. And we learned that in a terrifying way during the pandemic. We became very aware of who and what we allowed us to have close to us. How much we tried to separate ourselves from contagions. You remember during the pandemic, if anybody even coughed a little bit, you wanted them removed from your proximity. I think this is true of all hopeless situations and all lost causes. Every circumstance we find ourselves in where we lose our sense of agency and optimism, whether it's relational turbulence or a career setback or a physical health challenge or a mental health battle. We need to remember that we will not always feel the way we feel, and that things will not always feel as bleak as they do in the present moment. And hope says, keep going, because you will get to that different place. We know this from the things we've walked through, the trials that we've endured, the stuff that we've saved, the renovation we have been a part of. The question is, how does hope actually arrive? Is it a change that we take note of, or is it a change in us that alters how we perceive the data? It's interesting, whenever there's been a viral outbreak of any kind, there's always an effort to trace the illness back to a single source, to find out how something began. It's often called a patient zero. And one of the most important pieces of the idea of hope is to remember that we can be contagions of hope. We can be the source of the change in the temperature around us. We can become patient zero in an outbreak of optimism. And we are always capable of something beautiful. This week, the New York Times published an op-ed entitled, "Joy is not a Strategy." I disagree. Joy is a strategy. Optimism is a strategy. Hope is a strategy. It is the working assumption that makes the foundation of everything you do. It's how you decide to look at this world and other people and yourself and the possibilities. And we've seen what happens when fear is a strategy, when nihilism is a strategy, and when hatred is a strategy, and that those things are terrifyingly contagious too. We've been immersed in a misery epidemic for far too long, and some people want us to stay there. And this is where we need to have the courage to say we're not going to. Anne Frank wrote in her diary, "I don't think of all the misery, but of the beauty that still remains." I don't think of all the misery, but the beauty that still remains. I think that's our job today, because beauty remains. We've spoken before about the difference between hope and gratitude here, that hope is by nature aspirational. It's a propellant forward. It's toward a time and a place where something is better than it is in this moment, where some of the wrong is made right. It is a view of something just beyond the horizon. Hope exists perpetually in the future. It is a soon to be, a yet to come, a one day soon, which means it'll always be just a little bit out of reach. And that's why hope is an inside job. We all have things trending in our heads every day, don't we? Words that occupy the daily bandwidth of our thoughts and monopolize our attention as we move through the world. And these words become the lenses through which we see everything. Our worth, our significance, the day set before us, the life we want now, the future well beyond us. And the things trending in our heads have incredible power to lift or derail us in the present. And so we need to make sure of something. We need to make sure they're not lies. We need to make sure there are true words in our heads. We need to be certain that we do not begin to believe as gospel what may not actually be true, lest we build our sense of peace and security on something fraudulent. For a while now, I've seen many people for whom hopelessness seemed to be trending. People worn down by an endless stream of bad news, exhausted from their never-ending battles, people depleted and bitter and concluding that there is little reason to keep going. And I've had people say that to me. They've said it to me in person and they've written it to me online and said, "John, there's no point." There's a point. If you've been a contagion of hopelessness, I want you to know that I understand. I've been living alongside you for far too often in that place. And that's why I want to tell you the truth in a lucid moment. Hopelessness doesn't deserve to have the top spot in your head. It is not worth the joy it displaces. Hopelessness is a liar. And see, the bad news has a way of staying with us. We see things that outrage or terrify us, and we sticky note them so that they are forever in front of us, reminding us of how terrible it all is. And we do this day after day, gradually accruing the evidence for why we should despair, seeing only the hurting people and not the helpful people, only the acts of violence and not the acts of kindness, only the failures of humanity and not where humanity is showing itself. The faces and the names and the images that discourage us become artificially magnified. And all the while, we let goodness fly beneath the radar of our awareness. We allow countless acts of mercy and displays of courage and affirmations of decency to go without acknowledging them. But we should. We should dwell on them, metabolize them into our hearts, and be strengthened to keep going. Aristotle says, hope is a waking dream. And I think we're starting to wake up for a little bit. Often the only thing required to rekindle hope is to be reminded that we are not alone. That's why I went to that concert. I just wanted to be with people. And the truth is, there are far more people in this place working for equality, diversity, love, and justice than those opposing them, and it's not even close. There are hundreds of millions of people in this world who, just like you, wake up every day trying to be the kind of person the world needs. They're lavish with compassion. They're overflowing with generosity. They're relentless in love. And you are, when you are not aware of it, surrounded on all sides by like-hearted people who are not okay with the suffering and ugliness around them either. Now, that isn't to say there isn't a great deal to grieve over and be alarmed by or pissed off about. It just means that these things aren't stronger than the massive, sprawling army of those who grieve, who are alarmed, and who are pissed off. It means that you are in good and plentiful company in your profound not all rightness. The vast majority of people feel as burdened as you are to make better days. And this is the story you need to tell yourself, because it is the truest one. Hope has two beautiful daughters, anger at the way things are, encouraged to see that they do not remain as they are. And we've spent a good deal of time in anger, and now is our time of courage, of courageous conversations, of courageous activism, of courageous thinking, of courageous social media, of courageous changes. The Dalai Lama said there is a saying in Tibetan, tragedy should be utilized as a source of strength. No matter what sort of difficulties, how painful experience is, if we lose our hope, that is our real disaster. So the assignment is simply this. Take down the sticky notes of disappointment and sadness so that you're able to see the landscape clearly again. Scan the horizon for the builders and the lovers and the helpers and the healers, and allow them the precious bandwidth they deserve. Let yourself be encouraged by the awesome, beautiful, brilliant goodness that still occupies this place, and allow a new word to ascend to the top spot in your mind where it belongs. Every day we have the opportunity to be contagions of hope. Let's try and remember how necessary that is and how much the world needs it. I'm going to close with the words of Maya Angelou, and then I'm going to open up the floor if you have something you'd like to share. She says, there were people who went to sleep last night, poor and rich and white and black, but they will never wake again. And those dead folks would give anything at all for just 5 minutes of this weather, or 10 minutes of plowing. So you watch yourself about complaining. What you're supposed to do when you don't like a thing is change it. And if you can't change it, change the way you think about it.